The morning of her wedding, Violet did not cry. Her mother cried. Her aunt cried. The seamstress who had altered the dress 3 times cried. Though no one had asked her to, Violet stood in the center of the room with her arms slightly lifted while they fastened the last of the buttons. And she looked at herself in the tall mirror and thought, "This is the day. This is actually the day." She had known about the arrangement since she was 19. Her father, Dr. Harlow, had come to her after Sunday dinner one evening and explained it the way he explained most things, plainly, without apology, the way a physician explains a prognosis to a patient who has asked for the truth. The Ashworth family had land in the valley. The Ashworth son, Edmund's age, respectable, not unkind by any account, needed a wife before he could take formal control of the estate. Her father's practice had debts. The land held a water easement that ran behind their property. There were practical reasons on both sides. Violet had listened. She had asked 2 questions. The first was whether the man in question had agreed to this willingly. Her father said yes. The second was whether she had any real choice in the matter. Her father was quiet for long enough that she had her answer, so she had agreed. And now she was 22, and her buttons were done, and a carriage was waiting outside. His name was Cormac Ashworth. She had met him 4 times before the wedding, twice at formal dinners, once at a neighbor's harvest gathering, and once, briefly, at the post office in town, where they had stood next to each other for approximately 90 seconds while the postmaster searched for a package. He was tall. He had gray eyes and an economy of expression that she initially mistook for shyness. He was not shy. He was simply a man who had decided, some years ago, that most things did not require comment. The ceremony was short. He said his vows in a clear, even voice. She said hers. There was a reception at the house with people she mostly recognized, and some she didn't, and Cormac moved through it the way he seemed to move through most things. Correctly, efficiently, without warmth. At one point she found herself standing next to him, while a neighbor congratulated them both, and she became aware, in the way you become aware of a draft in a room, that he was not touching her. Not her hand, not her arm. They were standing 6 inches apart, and might as well have been strangers waiting for a train. That night, in the large bedroom of the Ashworth house that was now, apparently, also her house, she lay awake for a long time listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the building settling around her, and thought, well, here we are. She had not expected love. She had been careful not to expect it. What she had permitted herself to expect, quietly, privately, was something like civility, basic acknowledgement. The ordinary courtesies that people extended to house guests and distant relations and anyone, really, who shared their table and their name. She learned over the following weeks that Cormac Ashworth extended those courtesies to everyone except, apparently, her. Not unkindly. She would have preferred unkindness. In some ways, it would have given her something to respond to. Instead, he was simply absent. Present in the house, present at meals, present when his business required him to be, but absent in the way that mattered. When she spoke, he listened with the portion of his attention that could be spared. When she made decisions about the household, and she made many, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Pollard, had been waiting years for someone to actually take charge, he neither approved nor objected. When she entered a room he was already in, his eyes moved to her and then away, the way they moved to a window or a clock. Registering, not seeing. She tried. She wanted to be honest about this, even later, when it would have been easier to pretend she hadn't. She tried. She asked him about the estate and listened carefully to his answers, and followed up with real questions. She learned the names of his tenants. She learned which fields ran well and which needed attention. She asked about his childhood once, and he had answered briefly, and then looked at his food, and she had understood that she was not supposed to ask again. She tried for 8 months. Then she stopped trying, and started simply living. This was, she realized, an underrated approach. The estate was large and there was always work. Not the decorative kind of work that ladies were supposed to busy themselves with, not embroidery and calls and the careful management of social schedules, but real work, the kind that made a difference. The tenant cottages on the eastern side of the property had roofs that were failing. Violet noticed because she noticed most things, and she mentioned it to Cormac, and he said he would look into it, and 3 months later, the roofs were still failing and she had stopped waiting for him to look into it, and had simply arranged for it herself, working with a carpenter named Silas, who had strong opinions about cedar shingles and was right about all of them. She started keeping a ledger, not a household accounts book. She had one of those already, but a different kind, a record of what she saw on the estate and what it needed and what she had done about it. She wrote out in the mornings before Cormac was up. on a gray mare named Juniper, who had strong opinions of her own. And she visited the tenants and learned their names and their children's names, and which families were struggling, and which were managing, and what the difference was. The tenants called her Mrs. Ashworth at first, formally, carefully, the way they would have addressed any new wife. But somewhere in the second year she became Violet to most of them, or just Mrs. V, which she liked. Old Mr. Kitch, who had been on the land for 40 years and had opinions about every Ashworth he'd ever encountered, told her once, after she'd helped him move a fallen fence post in the rain, that she was nothing like he'd expected. She said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Someone who'd last a year and then go home to her father." She said, "My father's practice is doing well now, actually," and he laughed, and that was that. Cormac knew she rode out in the mornings. He knew she met with the tenants. He knew about the roofs, eventually. Someone must have told him, or he noticed the repairs himself, but he didn't mention it to her. Not to question it, not to thank her, not to acknowledge it. It simply became another thing that happened on the estate that he did not comment on. She heard him, once, at a gathering of neighboring landowners, talking about the Ashworth yields. They were good that year, better than they'd been in several years. In fact, because she had done some careful work with the drainage on the north fields, and the results had shown. One of the other men asked him what he'd changed. Cormac said that the land was just producing well this season. He did not mention her name. She was standing close enough to hear this. She turned away and went to find the lemonade. That was in the second year. By the third year she had stopped being surprised by things like that. There was a woman named Caroline Vane, who came to the valley in the autumn of the third year, recently widowed, recently arrived from the east with a house near Calder Creek, and a quality of being interested in things that Violet recognized and missed. They met at a church supper, and found themselves in conversation, without quite planning it, standing near the pie table for nearly an hour, while the room moved around them. And by the end of the evening, Violet felt something that she had not felt in a long time. The particular lightness of being with someone who was actually listening. Caroline became a friend. The first real friend she'd had in the valley. She found herself laughing, sometimes, when she was with Caroline. Laughing properly, not the polite, careful kind of laugh that accompanied social gatherings, but the kind that came from something being genuinely, unexpectedly funny. Once she laughed so hard at something Caroline said about a misunderstanding with a local shopkeeper that she had to put her hand on a fence post to stay upright. And when she finally recovered, she looked up to find that Cormac had ridden past at some point during this, and was now about 30 yards away on his horse, not moving, watching her. When she looked at him, he looked away and continued on. She thought nothing of it. Or she told herself she thought nothing of it. The letter she found in her third winter at Ashworth was from her father, and it had been written before the wedding. She found it tucked inside a book of Welsh poetry that had been her father's. One of the volumes that had come with her things from home, packed by her mother along with several others, without anyone asking too carefully which books to include. She hadn't opened this one in over 2 years. She'd reached for it on a rainy afternoon in November when she'd run out of anything else to read, and the letter had fallen out from between the pages, still sealed, her name written on the front in her father's particular handwriting. She sat with it for a moment before she opened it. Her father had written, among other things, that he was sorry, that he knew he had not given her a real choice, and that he had told himself it was for practical reasons, when the real reason was that he had been afraid, and that fear was not an excuse. He had written that he believed, based on what he knew of Cormac Ashworth, that the man was not cruel, but that not cruel was not the same as good, and that she deserved someone who understood the difference. He had written that if she found herself unhappy, she should not stay out of obligation to him or to the family, because he would rather have her free than settled. He had written that he loved her. It was the longest letter he had ever written her. He had died 6 months after her wedding, before she'd been back home to visit. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her own ledger, in the inside back cover, where she kept things she wanted to keep. She rode out longer than usual the next morning. She went all the way to the eastern edge of the property, past the repaired cottages with their cedar shingle roofs, past the drainage channel she had rerouted in the second year, past the small stand of ash trees where a family of tenants named Breckett had built a henhouse that was, honestly, better constructed than most of the permanent outbuildings on the estate. The morning was cold and clear, and Juniper moved steadily under her, and the land was quiet, and she thought about what her father had written. She thought about it for a long time. When she got back to the house, Cormac was at breakfast. She sat down across from him and poured herself tea, and he looked at his newspaper and she looked at the window, and the silence between them was the same as it always was, not hostile, not warm, simply a room with two people in it who had run out of things to say to each other, or had perhaps never had much to say, she thought. I have done everything I could do here, she thought. That is the truth, she thought. My father was right. Not about leaving. She didn't think about leaving in those terms, not yet. But she thought about what free meant, and whether you could be free while remaining in a place, and what it would require. She decided, very quietly, over her tea, that she was going to stop performing. Not stop working. She loved the work, the estate work, the real things. She would not stop that. But she was going to stop the other performance. The performance of a wife who was still hoping. She was going to stop sitting with her posture, arranged in a way that indicated she was open to conversation. She was going to stop angling topics towards subjects he had shown marginal interest in. She was going to stop being careful. She was going to simply be. The change was, she suspected, invisible to most people. It was invisible to Cormac for a long time. She attended the social functions they were expected to attend together. And she was polite, and she ate her meals, and she ran the household, and she managed the tenants. And she spent time with Caroline Vane, and she read her books, and she rode Juniper in the mornings. But she stopped looking at him when he came into a room. She stopped offering conversation. She stopped being available, in that particular way she had been available. Alert, waiting, hopeful, in some small residual way she hadn't fully admitted to herself. She was 25 by then. She had been married for 3 years. She had done enough hoping. She didn't know when he noticed. She suspected it was sometime in the spring, because that was when he started talking to her differently. Small things at first, asking her something about the estate, and then, when she answered, actually continuing the conversation instead of letting it drop, sitting down in the library in the evenings rather than retiring immediately, asking about Caroline once, carefully, the way you ask about something you're not sure you're allowed to ask about. She answered his questions. She was not cold. She had no interest in being cold. But she was no longer reaching. She spoke when she had something to say, and otherwise she did not speak. And this was, apparently, something he had not previously understood about her. That she could simply exist without filling the space. One evening, he sat across from her while she was reading and said, "You've changed." She looked up from her book. "Have I?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." She went back to her book. "I don't think so," she said. "I think I've been like this the whole time. You just weren't paying attention." He didn't answer. But he didn't leave either. He started riding out in the mornings, not with her. She noticed he was careful not to intrude on her routes, but on the estate, more than he had before. And when he came back he sometimes mentioned what he'd seen, the way she had learned to mention what she saw, specifically, by name. The Keech fence, the Breckett family, the ash tree stand at the eastern edge that had come through the winter better than expected. She realized, one morning, that he had learned the tenants' names. She did not know what to do with this. He asked her about the ledger in June. He had found it somewhere. She'd left it on the table in the estate office, she thought, though she didn't remember, and he came to her in the kitchen, where she was talking through a meal schedule with Mrs. Pollard, and he held it up and said, "Is this yours?" "Yes," she said. "Can I read it?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said again. He read it that afternoon. She knew because she saw him in the estate office when she passed by, sitting very still with it open in front of him. She didn't stop to ask what he thought. That evening he said, "You rerouted the drainage channel." "In the second year, yes. I thought that was Silas. Silas did the construction. It was my design." He was quiet for a moment. "It was a good design," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to her reading. In July there was an evening gathering at the Vane house. Caroline had a talent for making people want to come to things, and Violet had helped her plan this one. A summer gathering with good food and the kind of conversation that actually went somewhere. She arrived before Cormac, who came late from some estate business, and by the time he arrived she was deep in conversation with Caroline and a neighbor called Dr. Marsh who had strong opinions about crop rotation, that she mostly agreed with and occasionally didn't. She was laughing at something Dr. Marsh had said when she became aware of Cormac standing near the door, looking at her. Not the way he used to look at her. Registering, not seeing. Something else. Something she didn't have a name for immediately. She looked back at him, once, briefly. Then she returned to Dr. Marsh's entirely defensible position on fallow cycles. Later, riding home he said, "You seem happy." "I am," she said. "Here, in the valley." "Yes." "With the work," he said. "With the tenants." With he seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. I think I understood what this estate was to me before you came, and I think I didn't understand what it could be. What you made it. Violet let Juniper pick her pace into the dark road. The trees were close on either side and the night was warm and the stars were out. The estate was already good land, she said finally. I just paid attention to it. I didn't, he said. Pay attention. To the land or to. He stopped. She waited. I said something, he said. To Thomas Hare and Brodie Graves last autumn, about the marriage. About the arrangement. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know what I meant by it, and I'm not proud of it. She looked at him in the dark. She could only see the outline of him, the shape of a man on a horse, holding the reins loosely the way he always did. What did you say? She asked. That it was a business arrangement. That I'd fulfilled my obligations. She absorbed this. Were those men friends of yours? I thought they were. And now? He was quiet for a long moment. Men who think of women as obligations aren't people I have much to say to anymore, he said. She thought about this for a while. The road bent and straightened again, and Juniper's hooves were steady on the packed earth. That's a beginning, she said. That's not an ending. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said. I think I'm just starting to. She didn't reach over and take his hand. She wasn't there yet, and she was honest with herself about where she was. But she let the silence sit between them differently than it usually did. Not like an empty room, but like a room that someone had just walked into and not yet spoken, and the question was not whether they would speak but what they would say when they did. By September, he had started sitting with her in the evenings on purpose. Not making conversation for the sake of it, she would have seen through that immediately, but simply being present. Reading on his own, occasionally saying something worth saying, occasionally not saying anything at all. She found she didn't mind. It was different from his earlier absence. An absence is a nothing. This was a presence that was still learning to be itself. He asked about her father once, in October, carefully. She told him about the letter, not all of it, but some of it. And she watched his face while she talked and she saw something there that she recognized. Shame, but not the self-protective kind. The kind that sits still and takes what it's owed. I should have made sure you received more of your father's things, he said. I handled the transfer badly. Yes, she said. You did. He nodded. He didn't argue with it. She thought of her father writing that she deserved someone who understood the difference between not cruel and good. She thought about what good meant, in practice, in the actual texture of a life. Whether it was something you were or something you did repeatedly until you had made it true about yourself. She thought Cormac Ashworth might be trying to find out. October gave way to November, and the estate settled into the quieter rhythms of winter, the work pulling inward, the tenants banking their fires, the fields resting. Violet kept her ledger and rode Juniper and spent time with Caroline, and sat in the evenings in the library with Cormac and felt carefully, guardedly, like a person who was living a life rather than waiting for one to begin. He told her, one morning in December, that there was going to be a gathering at the Hare estate. Thomas Hare, one of the men he had spoken to about the marriage the previous year. A winter party. He had received the invitation and he had come to tell her about it himself, standing in the kitchen while she finished her breakfast. And he said, I don't want to go, but I think we should. She looked up. Why? Because I said something last year in front of those men that I want to be seen to have been wrong about. I don't want to say it. I want to. I want us to simply be there, together, and I want them to see. She considered him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and he looked, for the first time she could think of, uncertain. All right, she said. The gathering was large, lantern-lit, the kind of occasion that a certain kind of prosperous household assembled 3 or 4 times a year to remind itself of its own good fortune. Violet wore a dark green dress that Caroline had told her was correct for her coloring, and went with Cormac in the carriage, and they arrived together, and she knew immediately upon entering the room that people noticed. Not because anything was said, but because of the particular quality of attention that falls on a couple when something about them has shifted. She talked with people she knew. She talked with people she didn't know. At one point, she found herself in conversation with Mrs. Hare, who was nothing like her husband, and had a quality of attention Violet had always liked, and they talked for a long time about a proposal that had come before the county board about tenant water rights. And Violet had opinions about this, because she had spent 2.5 years managing water on the Ashworth land, and her opinions were specific and grounded, and Mrs. Hare listened to all of them. She was still talking to Mrs. Hare when Cormac appeared at her side. Not interrupting, just arriving. She included him without being asked, summarizing the water rights question briefly so he could follow. And he asked one question and then another, and the three of them talked about it until the music began. When people began to move toward the dancing, Cormac said something to Miss Hare, something Violet didn't fully catch. She was looking at the room, the lights, the familiar faces, and then she heard her name. She turned. He was looking at her directly. "I owe you a proper introduction," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "We've been married 3 years." "I know," he said. He stopped. He looked at Mrs. Hare, who was watching them both with the expression of a woman who understood exactly what was happening. Then he looked back at Violet. "When we arrived tonight, Thomas Hare said something to me about the estate, about how well the Ashworth land has been doing, and I told him it was my wife who had made it what it is. And I said her name." Violet was very still, and then he made a kind of face. Cormac said, the way he does when something is not what he expected. And I thought. He was choosing his words with that particular care she had come to recognize. "I have let people believe something about our marriage that was not true, about what you were to me. And I would like to spend however much time is required correcting that impression." Mrs. Hare excused herself gracefully, without being asked. Violet stood in the middle of the lantern-lit room and looked at her husband. He was not comfortable. That was clear. He was a man who was doing something that did not come naturally to him, which was to stand in a room full of people and say true things out loud. She knew something about how hard that was. She had spent 3 years doing it to no one in particular, and she knew how much easier it was to say nothing. "You should have done this a year ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have done it on the first day." She looked at him for a long moment. The music had started somewhere on the other side of the room. The candlelight moved. "Well," she said. "You're saying it now." She took his offered arm, not with the particular warmth of forgiveness. She was not there yet, and she was not going to pretend to be, but with the particular honesty of a woman who was willing to see what happened next. Of a woman who had been paying attention her whole life and had learned, out of long practice, to trust what she saw. They walked out into the middle of the room, among the people who knew them and the people who didn't, and the music moved around them, and the candles burned, and Violet Ashworth held her head exactly as she always had. Not higher, not lower, precisely where it belonged. Outside, through the tall windows, the December dark lay over the valley, over the fields that had been drained, and the cottages that had been roofed, and the channel that ran clean through the eastern land. And the night was cold and very clear, the way nights get in December when the air has been washed through, and everything that was obscure has become at last plain.